Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
This is Lora Cecere with Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. Today, Alex and I are going to talk about my latest blog post, No Place for Cowboy Rhetoric. So, Alex, welcome to the show and tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for having me back on. Sure. My name's Alex Wisniewski. I work with the Digital PMO Group, and we help organizations with their digital transformation of large supply chain transformation projects. And we specialize in the project management, program setup, project ideation, all the way through project value realization and the change management that's required afterwards. So a holistic shop, but all across the digital transformation supply chain landscape.
So Alex is helping me with the social programs, getting ready for the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit, which is in September 6th at the Westin Hotel at Washington Dulles. And instead of me talking about my blog post, I thought it'd be interesting to have Alex ask me questions. Alex is a couple of generations younger than I am, and I thought it'd be good to get a younger voice to ask the older dog some questions. So Alex, let's chat about my blog post. What hit you in the blog post that you think is worth talking about?
Yeah, fantastic. I was really intrigued, by it was one of the most current announcements from the Biden-Harris administration, right? And it was their new initiative to improve supply chain data flow. And Laura, probably that on paper, that sounds really attractive, right? Improving
Right.
Supply chain data flow. But when you dive into it, you kind of mentioned that the goal of the program is to test a proof of concept information sharing exchange to potentially ease supply chain congestion by the end of this summer. So you kind of say, will it work? Well, it's going to work to exchange data, but it might not it might not achieve the goal that everyone's hoping for, right? The improvement of supply chain flows. In the article, tell me a little bit about, you mentioned the program shows a very rudimentary, the flow program shows a very rudimentary understanding of what's needed to solve a much deeper problem. Can you tell me about this deeper problem that you hint at?
Yes, so the flow program takes a small set of trading partners, very focused on logistics flows through the ports, and connects the shipping data on demurrage between the terminal operators and 3PLs and manufacturers, but a limited set, 19 to start with. And my question is that the goal is to improve visibility, and ocean flows are only a subset of visibility, and logistics is only a subset of supply chain visibility. And if
Sure.
we're really going to be talking about visibility, shouldn't we be talking about interconnectivity between the 19 operating networks, supply chain operating networks, that are in the industry that operate really in self-serving isolation? Companies like Ariba and GT Nexus, and which is now part of Infor, or Ita Open, Newology. These are all networks that serve their business users, but don't provide interoperability, and they also do not cross over source, make, and deliver. They do limited pieces. So Ita Open Genesis was to do direct procurement for a subset of electronic manufacturers. Newology's focus is on contract manufacturing. GT Nexus focuses on logistics. But really, to get at visibility, we need a holistic approach, source, make, and deliver, and we need process canonicals that can go over these networks that can help us to answer the question of not just where's my stuff, but how do I best make decisions given this world of uncertainty?
That's really interesting. Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Mandating that interoperability between parties, systems, you named a few of them there. In your article, Laura, you mentioned that basically what Flow is doing is the integration of data, right? Interoperability ensures that when that data is passed, the referential integrity, the data context, you mentioned semantic reconciliation, right? Those are all kept. So the example of DARPA being the catalyst for the internet and potentially the government being the catalyst for this network of networks across existing networks, and that's a lot of words of networks there. But I'm wondering, does the government have to solve this problem, or do you think a startup, a company could solve this problem?
Well, I used to think that a company could solve this problem, but I'm 20 years into this and I've not seen any company really able to drive this. So could somebody like Elon Musk do this? Yeah, because, he's got the fortitude and the drive to solve big, hairy problems and think out of the box. But what we have had in the market are really very self-serving niche solutions, not really going across source, make, and deliver. Google could solve this problem, but they have not come to the party. So if the government wants to be helpful, which their Flow announcement says they have interest, then I'm like, okay, let's be helpful. Let's force interoperability and let's design process canonicals for standardized flows that allow us to synchronize purchase orders, because the average purchase order goes through 3 changes, and it's not a ship to order match, and the drayage processes has a lot of process latency, so this data is not available at the speed of business. Let's work with the existing supply chain operating networks to basically build a layer of visibility that can cross over, sort of like the steps that they took with the baby bells when they forced the breakup of, Ma Bell and forced interoperability for the baby bells.
Yep, and the other one you mentioned, right, is interoperability across EIN for taxation purposes. I thought that was another really interesting use case where government stepped in there too. So the big takeaway that I heard from that is a startup an existing company could solve that problem if they have that outside of the box, potentially untraditional thinking to solve it and approach it. And then obviously the holistic understanding of the problem as well, not the niche solution, but the big thing that I heard, the driver that would solve this problem quicker than of the private sector, Laura, was the government could force the hand of organizations to do this. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Yeah. And then the other interesting piece, and I would like you to dive into this, right, is around how that would help increase visibility into things such as, sustainability principles, right? Carbon reporting, and then also tie into the port congestion. I think that's another interesting point you mentioned in the article, right? The interoperability, not only between ports, but then the interoperability between port and the port networks.
Right. And so the Chinese, which have aggressively invested in the ports, are building a network across their ports and their terminal operators. And, they're not being laissez-faire about it. They're forcing compliance. And we need all the AIS and port data around the world into our networks, but we need to really look at outside-in processes and how we drive interoperability. And a big piece of that is authoritative identifiers. We don't have information about what is a company and what is a distribution center and what is a manufacturing center to really be able to have big T truth about, lineage and to be able to do track and trace. Today, we're just not clear, and that gets us into all kinds of issues and dark holes in the supply chain.
That makes a lot of sense. and those authoritative identifiers as we, Laura, I'm going to kind of round out that conversation if that's okay. You mentioned if the government was serious about driving supply chain information flows, what steps they could take. We've talked now about 3 of them. We've talked about implementing authoritative identifiers, mandating interoperability between existing parties. The third one is implementing port scheduling and visibility. That's that network across ports. You mentioned 2 more, Laura, carefully defining terms on each step of the journey for improvement. And I thought that was really interesting because I kind of tied it to the problem you mentioned with supply chain programs over the last administration in your article, which is their sole focus has been around logistics without a holistic approach, that supply chains in the commercial world include more than just logistics, right? It's procurement, it's manufacturing and logistics. So how do you think about tackling this change management initiative in tandem with kind of your points around programs with clear terms and standards of identity?
Yeah, so, and this gets to the process canonical definitions of how do we do business. And, if we had authoritative identifiers and we had process canonicals that go across these networks, we'd have a much higher level of visibility. And that's what I think people really need, but they don't know enough to ask for it. And so instead, they're asking questions about integration versus interoperability. And interoperability allows us to keep the context and the semantics of the data across trading partners, and authoritative identifiers allow us to authoritatively track. So there's a big step that we need to take to be able to redefine work, but if the government wants to be a driver here, there is a place that they could play in helping us with those multi-tier canonical adoption and the authoritative identifiers.
Understood. And in this article, Laura, you have the last step, which is educate. And when the way I outlined them, they weren't the way you outlined them in your article, but the way you have them outlined them in the article are 1 through 5. Are these steps prioritized?
No, they weren't, but they could be. What do you think is the most important?
I think kind of one thing that I've seen as being crucial is clearly the first step that I think you've identified, right? Clearly defining the terms is usually a first step that I've taken in projects that I've been participating in. And then your article really convinced me on the necessity for authoritative identifiers, but I was almost going to put 3 in front of 2, which was mandating interoperability before your point number 2. But I'd love to point as well, or your priority.
Well, it's hard for me to rate them. I think they go together. And a lot of it is the mental model of how do we really drive visibility. Most people talk about visibility, but they don't really define what it means. And they look at it from a functional view of logistics or procurement or manufacturing, not a holistic view, and not necessarily just how do I track and trace or where's my stuff, but proactive management and sensing and tracking and trace, to be able to meet some of our sustainability initiatives. So I think we got a lot of work to do, but it starts with clear definitions and authoritative identifiers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Steps 1 and 2. Yeah, that makes sense. And one point that you just made me think of, right, was when you talked about this holistic view, I thought about this cross-sector partnership that flow, or, it's a proof of concept, right? It's only 19 parties. You mentioned this, but it's cross-sector partnership. How would you envision a similar partnership to tackle these 5 steps that you've outlined? Or is that something that really the government needs to just step in and fix, like you mentioned prior?
Well, I think that they could call all of the leaders from the supply chain operating networks to a meeting, and they could basically ask for, brainstorming of how this could be done. And then they could dictate that the items bought for the government would have to go through networks that are interoperable.
Understood. So if you want the government contract, you need to be leading edge with your supply chain, and that will kind of help force the industry in that way. It'll push the industry forward. It won't really hold it back or force innovation in a negative way. It'll force innovation in the way of competition.
Right.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was really interesting.
It got 80,000 views, and I think it got 20 shares. Lots of dialogue about it. Things that we think are so easy, like visibility, really require us to roll up our sleeves and have a much deeper look.
That's amazing. Yeah, I bet everyone kind of has a, at least I thought when I was reading your article, if I had a magic wand, what would be my top 3 priorities for flow? And I was wondering, Laura, what your thoughts was. I imagine that's what a lot of people were thinking about this. Well, I would do this. If I were to institute a nationwide or a national program, I would do this. What would your top 3 things if you were to do something similar to flow? Obviously, probably pretty in hand with 5 that you mentioned below. But anything kind of different or anything that you feel would need to lay the foundation? Obviously, the defined terms, the authoritative identifiers. Anything else you would identify there?
The other thing that I would do is work on better synchronization of data at the ports. The typical port has 7 terminals, and those terminals will operate independently. So even if we worked on the synchronization of the data of the ports, that would be a big first step.
I definitely agree there. And you mentioned, right, that kind of ties into the next part of that is there's the data piece of the ports, but also the physical infrastructure of the ports. And not only the physical infrastructure of the ports, but kind of the unloading and the automation that's required on top of the data. So it's a big problem to tackle. That's for sure. I wanted to ask you one last question kind of on that flow topic, which is something that was in the Biden-Harris administration announcement around the new supply chain initiative to improve data flows. And basically they tout, this is a question I think a few people are asking. They tout that this is going to lower the cost of goods for families. How would this realistically lower the cost for families? Can you help me understand that?
That would be my question to them if I was ever able to talk face to face. It's illogical to me, but it's good marketing.
Sure. So it's good marketing. That's a fair way to. I got it. I was hoping you'd give me a shaman style answer here, Laura.
Well, let's wrap up today, and hopefully we will see everyone at the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit on September 6th. And we're confirming speakers. We have 4 speakers confirmed, and we'll be placing those on the website next week. All the best. Until next time.